All right, thank you. Thank you, Don. Thank you. Thank you, Don. I think Don belongs to 20 organizations because I've spoken at all of them. And by the way, I think this is about the 100th, maybe 100 or so Rotary clubs that I've done. You guys have the smallest flag of any Rotary country in the state of Minnesota. We got to work on that a little bit here. Got to work on that here.
Size doesn't matter.
It's great to be here. I love Roseville. My daughter's a third grade teacher at Central Park Elementary School here, so Roseville's pretty close to my heart. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a professional athlete, like a lot of kids. And that dream died in Little League. I made Little League history. I was the first player in Little League history to ever be traded. And my dad was my coach. So that ended my baseball, my professional sports career. But somewhere along the line, somebody said, you know something, Schmidt, with your big mouth and your love of sports, you ought to become a sportscaster. And from that moment on, in my mind, I decided I wanted to be on TV and be a sportscaster. You see, what somebody did for me is they made an impact on me. That impact, that little word, that little phrase, changed the course of my life. And that's when I started to think about impact. Through our research, we found out that we make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. Let me say that again. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. I call this silent impact. And that's what I want to talk about today, because we make an impact in everything we do, in everything we say, how we act, how we react, what our attitude is, what our body language is. It all leaves a mark. It all leaves an impact. And what we all need to do is to become more aware and more intentional with the impact we have on each other. Because you want that impact to be positive instead of negative. I'm a sportscaster, which means I've got the best job in the world. I work 3 minutes a night. I get paid to go to games, and when I'm at those games, they feed me. But after the game's over, I got to go to a dirty, stinky, smelly locker room and get half-naked men to say something intelligent. Sometimes this is not always so easy. I'm talking to a baseball player. His team is qualified for the World Series for the very first time. So I say to him, what is this like? You're going to be playing in the World Series. You had to dream about this day since you were a kid. And the guy looks up at me and he said, you know, Joe, I can sum up how I feel in 3 words. It don't get no better than this. Now, not every interview I get is crazy. Sometimes I meet some dynamic leaders. Sometimes I meet some people who make an impact on this world. I covered a track coach at the University of Minnesota by the name of Roy Griak. You might be familiar with Roy. Roy coached the Gophers for over 32 years. He coached Big Ten champs. He coached national champs. He coached athletes who competed in the Olympics. He had a very successful career, and even after he retired, he stayed very involved in the program into his 90s. Well, as Roy was getting to pass, I started reading tributes to Roy on his Facebook page and on his CaringBridge site. And I recognized the names of the people who were writing the tributes because they were the Big Ten champs, the national champs, and the Olympians. And all of a sudden, something struck me when I was reading all those tributes. Not one of them said, remember that Big Ten title we won. I would have never made it to the Olympics without you. Remember that big meet we won in Iowa. Not one of them. They all said things like, I'm a better parent today because you were in my life. I'm a better man today because you were my coach. I just finished the biggest business deal of my life using Roy Griak 101. And it got me to thinking, Roy Griak was not a success because of all the trophies he won and the shiny objects in this trophy case. Roy Griak lived a life of significance because of the impact he had on the world, the silent impact he had on the world. You see, the shiny objects were a byproduct of Roy leading this life of significance and being a person of great impact. Now, I'm going to do a couple things just a little bit different here today because I don't have a lot of time and I want to have some questions and answers, but I want to make sure that your minds are working today because I want us to think about the way we impact other people differently. So I want to see if we can open your minds. I want to see how smart Roseville is. On the count of 3, can you all say out loud what color a yield sign is? 1, 2, 3.
Yellow.
They have been red and white since 1974. You see, sometimes we have things in our mind that we think are right that maybe aren't right. And sometimes that tells us, let's look at things a little bit differently. So let's look for ways to be more aware and intentional with our impact. Now, I've been lucky enough. I joined the National Speakers Association, and my good friend Manny Style is here to support me today, and Manny's a legend in the speaking business. And what you really try to do is you try to make sure that your message resonates with people, but it also changes people. So I started thinking about how can we get people to be more aware and intentional with the impact they have. So one of the exercises I came up with when I worked with companies and associations and leadership groups is I came up with the concept, if you could name the 4 most influential, impactful people in your life, who would you put on your personal monument, your personal Mount Rushmore of influence? So if you could look back at your life and figure out who helped you get to where you are today professionally, who helped you personally when things were going rough, who's there to support you in good times but also in bad times. If you want, I'll just pass these around just so everybody has one, because I think this is a really good exercise. If you want to make an impact on other people in your life, figure out who had an impact on your life and emulate what they do, and then figure out why they did it. That will help you have a bigger impact. I did this exercise. A couple of years ago, I spoke to 100 high school leaders. 100 high schools sent 2 leaders from their high school to this leadership conference. I worked with the kids in the morning. I worked with their parents in the afternoon. And then at night, I brought them all together. And I had them compare their Mount Rushmores of influence. And afterwards, I had a line over here of kids and a line over here of parents. The kids were telling me, I learned more about my mom and dad today than I did in the first 16 years of my life. I had parents over here telling me, I learned more about my kids than I did in the first 16 or 17 years of their life. So as we get to the holiday season, you want to have a fun exercise? You want to get to know more about your kids, your grandkids? Do this exercise. Fill out your Mount Rushmore and have them fill out theirs. You'll find out things. There are people in your life that your kids, your grandkids know about, but they don't really know the story behind the story. And if you want to make an impact, you've got to make deeper and more meaningful connections. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. Now, I wrote my first book, Silent Impact, basically because I started talking to Rotary clubs and I started telling these stories. I started telling stories about guys like Roy Grieg, and I started telling stories about different people. And anyway, people told me, said, Joe, you got to write your stories down and write a book. Well, I'm no dummy, I wrote a book. I ended up writing a second book based on what I learned in the first 5 years after writing my first book. I did this exercise to the Minnesota Correctional Association, prison guards in Minnesota. This was right after the state of Minnesota lost 2 prison guards to tragedies inside the prison. 400 prison guards. They were not happy. They were scared. It was the toughest room I ever worked. And I had a half-day session with them, and I had them all fill out their Mount Rushmores. And I thought, how am I going to get anybody to open up about who's on their Mount Rushmore? In the back of the room, a gentleman raised his hand. And he said, can I tell you who's on my Mount Rushmore? I said, yes. His name was Mark Magnuson. He said his brother Tim was on his Mount Rushmore of influence. But Tim didn't go on his Mount Rushmore until he passed away. And I said, please explain. He said, well, we grew up in a big family in northern Minnesota. I could have had any of my brothers or sisters on my list, but Tim went on after he passed away because I figured out the impact he had on the world. He said that Tim got a job in Columbus, Ohio. And when Columbus was awarded a National Hockey League franchise, the Columbus Blue Jackets, because Tim played a lot of sports when he was a kid, he loved hockey, he wanted to get a job with the team. He ended up being the elevator operator on game day for the team. So he was the guy who would push the buttons on the elevator, but he was the elevator operator for the players' family, management families, but he wasn't just a guy who pushed buttons. He learned how to push people's buttons in a good way. He got to know all the kids. He had nicknames for all the players. He had treats for the kids. He knew when it was someone's birthday. He became part of the team. Well, unfortunately, Tim was diagnosed with ALS, and he worked with the team as long as he possibly could. When Tim passed away, Mark went from Minnesota down to Columbus to his funeral. And about a half hour before the funeral started, a bus pulled up. It was the Columbus Blue Jackets, who had just gotten off a 7-day road trip. They went 1/2 hour out of their way to come and pay tribute to the guy who ran the elevator for the team on game day. He said, that's when Tim went on my Mount Rushmore of influence, because I really realized it was the little things in life that become the big things. And Tim made connections that count, and Tim did things that people cared about. But he said, Joe, when you were giving your presentation today, you gave me goosebumps. Remember when I told you Tim was a pretty good athlete? He said, Tim was a great athlete. Tim ran track in college. His coach was Roy Griak of the University of Minnesota. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. And that impact we have is real, it's powerful, it's profound, it's contagious, and it can last a long, long time. So I started gathering stories like Tim. And a year and a half ago, I had major back surgery. I had a back fusion surgery. And I had planned I was going to be out of work for 4 to 5 weeks, so I had planned I was going to watch a lot of Netflix. I had 5 books I wanted to read, and I did that for one day, and I said, that is not going to work for 5 weeks. So I started writing, and I started writing about the stories and the people that I learned from in the past 5 years, and I came up with my second book, and it's called The Impact Blueprint, a step-by-step journey to a life of significance. And what I did was I took 52 values with 52 different stories from people that I learned from. Manny Style is in the book right now because he is a world-renowned expert on listening. And he's written this fantastic book called Listening Leaders, because leaders who listen become the best leaders. And it's all about the communication. I'm going to do a little sidetrack here because my good buddy Sid Hartwright, he just did a story on him, 99 years old, from the Star Tribune. Sid's not a good listener because when you're talking to him, he's always looking around for somebody else in case somebody comes around that's more important. Drives me crazy. And Sid said that one of the great lines of all time in radio. He said there was a guy who died, and he said, well, it's too bad he smoked like a fish, to which I think meant he drank like a chimney. So I digress. But in this book are 52 traits and 52 values. For example, I've got a chapter in here, a short chapter in here on happiness. I happen to know Dan Buettner, the guy who's written the book, who went all over the world to find the people who lived the longest. He wrote a book called The Blue Zones, and then he went around the world to find the people who were the happiest, and he called that Thrive. And I asked him, I said, what are some of the things, I said, what did you change in your life after you examined the happiest people in the world? And that's kind of hard to quantify, but they figured out how to do it. And he said, well, first of all, he said he gets 8 hours of sleep no matter what, because sleep is that important to your health and your happiness. He said, secondly, he had the courage to get rid of negative friends and people in his life, which I think if we all look at, we all probably could do. And he said, last but not least, he said, he's got a box. And if anything falls inside that box, he says yes. If it's outside that box, he says no, and he sleeps comfortably about it. So these are, when you learn from, one of the things that I can do as a reporter, I can learn from really smart people. That's what I have. There's an old saying that our friend Mark LeBlanc says, that we have a mutual friend, use what you got to get what you want. And as a reporter, I'm kind of born with that as part of my DNA, so I can ask the questions and then respond down to them. But it's been a really, really wonderful trip. This is good stuff from a guy who grew up in Seymour, Wisconsin. Does anybody know where Seymour, Wisconsin is? You do. You were lost one day, huh? Yeah. Seymour, my high school was so small that we had driver's education and sex education in the very same car. That's a small school. That's a small school. But anyway, one of the gentlemen on my personal Mount Rushmore, because I grew up in Seymour near Green Bay, 13 miles from Green Bay, And early in my career, I covered the Green Bay Packers when Bart Starr was the head coach. And so I was a fan of Bart Starr when he was playing for the Packers, winning them Super Bowls. And then I got to cover him when he coached the Green Bay Packers. And back in those days, the media, we flew right with the team on team plane when they played a road game. And the Packers had a Monday night football game in late December in New York City. And if the Packers lose the game, they're out of the playoffs, and Bart Starr is probably going to get fired. Well, the Packers lost the game on a last-second field goal. We take the plane back to Green Bay, land at 2 o'clock in the morning in a blinding snowstorm. There's only one road from Austin Straubel Airport in Green Bay into town. And everybody on that plane, all 45 players, all the coaches, all the managers, all the media, we all took that same road back into town. And everybody passed a kid who was on the side of the road trying to change his tire in the middle of the snowstorm. One car stopped. The one car that you wouldn't expect to stop to help. It was Bart Starr. Of all the people I passed, everybody else passed himself. The one guy who probably had the most excuses not to stop was the one guy who stopped. I found out about it later because it was a kid that I graduated from high school with. As a matter of fact, his sister was my high school girlfriend. Had it been her, I would have blown the horn and waved and said, hey, good to see you, but I'm not bitter. But that had a big impact on me. So you fast forward. After I wrote Silent Impact, I had a speech at Lambeau Field. After I got done doing the presentation, I went into the ticket office because the Packer ticket director was an old friend of mine. And I said, you got Bart's address? I said, I wrote this book and I've got a couple of great stories in here about Bart because he means so much to me and meant so much to me early in my career. And I got the address and I sent the book off in the mail, and the next day I found out that Bart had a heart attack, a stroke, and some very serious health issues. I felt terrible for sending the book. Everybody was probably sending cards and flowers. I sent them a stupid book. Well, about 3 weeks later, I get a letter from Cherry Starr, from Bart's wife. And it said, Dear Joe, you probably have heard Bart has had some very serious health issues. He's doing very well, he's hanging in there. But I want to let you know something. We got your book, and I read the chapters of the stories you had to Bart, and you should have seen him light up that day. Thank you for helping Bart get through a tough time. And I started thinking, that's how this works. I mean, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to be a nice guy to someone who was nice to me. Reciprocity. And anyway, I ended up having an impact on him when he needed it. That's the way it works out. We do make our biggest impressions. We're not trying to be impressive. Now, I want to leave a few moments here for a few questions, because I know people have got to get going and the weather's kind of ugly, and then I'll just close it off with a story or two. So if you have any questions about the work I've done with Impact, the work I've done with Manny and the National Speakers Association, or even on sports, because I do cover that. I do have an A job, so I will be there tonight. I can do that, and then I'll just put a button on it at the end. Yes?
Thanks for coming, Joe. I
You bet.
appreciate that. I'm curious, when you've gotten feedback on this, how many times do parents make the Mount Rushmore?
Well, here's what I do. I tell people they can't put their parents on there. But I will tell you this. Teachers are on a lot. Coaches are on a lot. Siblings are on a lot. Bosses are on a lot. And we did research on bosses. And we found out that the best bosses were tough but fair, because that equaled trust. And the reason the boss was tough, because he believed in you. He saw something, or she saw something in you that you did not see in yourself. And later people realized it, and they ended up being on their Mount Rushmore of influence. And what's really always very nice, whenever I do this exercise in a longer setting, is there will always be a few people in the room. Well, I'll ask the question, did anybody put somebody in this room on their list? And the hand will always go up. And then I'll go, if they're willing to share, they'll share who it is. And usually have somebody in the corner sobbing, you know? So it's powerful, powerful stuff. So, yes?
Joe, have you, over time, have you seen a change in who gets nominated or the types of people that get nominated? So maybe when you first put this out, it was one type of people, maybe now you see it's trending in a different direction?
No, I think there are a lot of common denominators. One of them is timing. because you never know when the person sitting next to you is going through something heavy. You never know when that person needs a pat on the back, needs some support, needs somebody to care. So I think timing is a big deal, but I also think the other part of it is just caring. I think I call it, I call it they have it part of their DNA. They can just kind of sense that, you know what, that person needs to pick me up today. Sometimes that pick me up might be a pat in the butt, and sometimes it might be a kick in the butt. So that happens once in a while. So really haven't noticed changing. It's just kind of people who care.
I have a question. In the first book, you had the story about Joan Mauer.
Mm-hmm.
Would you kind of comment on that?
Yeah, and it's a story that I use most of the time, and I know that I spoke to quite a few people have seen me speak at other things, so I didn't tell it today. But long story short, when Joe Mauer was in high school, 19 years ago, Joe would walk a special needs student who was blind to the lunchroom and invite him to sit down at his table. So I put my reporter's cap on, and I went and I found 6 guys who sat around that table every day, and they started telling me the stories of the impact it still had. They all remembered it as if it was yesterday. They said that Joe would walk, Mike Hawley was the kid's name, would walk Mike to his next class once lunch was over. Well, by the end of the first quarter, the guys at the table would fight over who got to walk Mike to the next class. Wednesdays was pizza day, and Mike would spill some crumbs on his clothing, pizza sauce on his chin or his cheek. Joe would wipe them off, brush them off, and get him ready for his next class. By the end of the first quarter, they were all doing this. These are high school kids, the most selfish creatures on God's green earth. But that's the kind of impact that Joe had. And that's the kind of impact these selfless, kind, caring acts have. That's how you live a life of significance. And I believe that all the shiny objects are a byproduct of just all trying to be more aware and intentional with our impact. We all screw up, believe me, plenty of times. But if we all just get a little bit better at it, it's going to make us, and when you live this life of significance, you're happier, you're healthier, you're more productive at work, you're going to be the kind of person people want to be around. It's just a great way to go through life, especially for leaders. Manny.
Perhaps you'll close with it, but will you share the story about the impactful nun?
Well, that's a long story. The impactful nun. You see, I got a bad habit. I go after nuns. It's late in the day. It's late in the day. No. You know what? That's like a 7-minute story.
Love it.
You guys want to hear it? Okay. Okay. I was trying to respect your time. Does anybody have some water? I ran out of water. So I heard about a nun from northern Minnesota who was a prime example of silent impact. So I put my reporter's cap on trying to find her. And unfortunately, I found her in the obituary section of the Brainerd Dispatch. Her name was Sister Helen Marosla. And in her obituary, it said she had taught at Catholic schools in Minnesota, Kentucky, and Texas. She lived a life of servitude. She was born in 1935, and she passed away in 2000. Sister Helen was teaching 3rd grade in a Catholic school in Morris, Minnesota, northern Minnesota. When into her classroom walks a young kid by the name of Mark Eklund. Now, Mark's a pretty good kid. He's a little bit of a troublemaker. He talked way too much. At one point, Sister put some Scotch tape over his mouth to get him to shut up. That didn't work. They both laughed about that. We fast forward a couple of years, and Sister's now teaching high school math. And into her classroom walks Mark Eklund, a little taller, a little more handsome, still a little bit of a troublemaker, but they had a great relationship. Well, one week, Sister was trying to teach the class a new math concept, and the kids were just not getting it. Sister knew she had to change the atmosphere in the classroom. So she told everybody to take out a sheet of paper, and the kids thought, oh no, a pop quiz. She goes, no, here's your assignment. For the rest of the hour, I want you to write down all your classmates' names down the left-hand side column of the paper. And I want you to spend the rest of the hour writing down the nicest thing you can say about each and every one of your classmates. So the kids got right on the list. They knew each other since they went to grade school through the Catholic school system. And when the bell rang, everybody handed in their paper, and Sister over the weekend compiled everybody in the individual list. On Monday, the kids got back to school and Sister handed out everybody their list. And right away, she could tell that the atmosphere in the classroom had changed. The kids were smiling, they were laughing, they were having a good time. And when she started teaching, everybody was fully engaged. And soon this math problem, which nobody understood on Friday, was understood by all on Monday. Sister thought success. We fast forward a couple more years. Sister's returning home from vacation. She lands at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, and her dad picks her up for the ride back to northern Minnesota. And on the ride home, her dad says, "Honey, the Eklunds called." And Sister goes, "Oh, how is Mark? I've been thinking about him so much lately." And her dad said, "Honey, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Mark died in the Vietnam War. His funeral is tomorrow, and the family asked that you come." Well, Sister was very sad, and of course she went to Mark Eklund's funeral. And at his gravesite, he was given a 21-gun salute. And a young soldier approached Sister Helen and said, "Were you Mark's math teacher?" And she said, "Yes, I was." He said, "I served with Mark in Vietnam. He talked about you a lot." Sister was stunned. The family had invited everybody to the family farm after the burial to finish the celebration of Mark Eklund's life over lunch. And at that lunch, Sister was sitting there, and Mark's parents approached Sister. They said the Army had sent back Mark's belongings, and they wanted her to see something. Out of a plastic bag, they pulled out a wallet. And out of the wallet, they pulled out a tattered, crinkled piece of paper with yellowed Scotch tape on it. It was the list. Mark had carried the list with him to his dying day. Soon some of Mark's classmates gathered round. One said, "I have my list, it's in my wedding album." Another one said, "I have my list, it's in my sock drawer." A third, a gentleman, pulled out his wallet and pulled out a tattered, crinkled piece of paper. They all had their list. Now the message of the list from way back, so what happened is Sister decided to write an article for a religious education magazine to inspire young teachers to be creative, to be innovative, to show the passion and caring that they have for the kids. And she told the story about the list. Well, as fate would have it nowadays, it got online. It ended up in one of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books. She was in Reader's Digest. But before she died, she gave one interview about the list. And she was asked, "What was the lesson you were trying to teach those kids so long ago?" And she said there were a couple of lessons. One, you can always find something nice to say about everybody. And two, we all need to praise more, condemn less. Praise more, condemn less. The message of Sister Helen's list is alive and kicking today. I know that for a fact because I found 6 of Mark Eklund's classmates. All 6 said if they had to put their personal Mount Rushmore of influence up, Sister Helen is on it. They all said they tried to teach the lessons from Sister Helen onto their kids and now onto their grandkids. Vicki McNally said on her list she was funny, she was a good athlete, and she had nice long legs. Judy Swanson said on her list she was loyal, she was good at art, and she had luscious lips. So we know the hormones were raging for at least one of the kids in Sister Helen's class. Jim Halby was not at Mark Eklund's funeral. He had a pretty good excuse. He was half a world away fighting in the war in Vietnam himself. And in his wallet was the list. And I said to Jim, "Why did you bring that list with you all the way to Vietnam?" He said he was packing the night before and he saw the list on his dresser. And he said, "You know what? I think I'll throw up my wallet in case I have a bad day. I can look at it. It'll make me feel better." I had a lot of bad days in Vietnam. You see, of all the things I've learned about people who live this life of significance and have more impact on the world than others, is they figured out it's the intersection of 2 very human traits. We all want to be liked, and we all want to leave a legacy. So why don't we all try to be just a little bit better at the impact we have? And last but not least, and this is what I'll leave you with here today, because it's the secret to making an impact. It's not about other people, them liking you. That's not it at all. That's not it. It's about them liking themselves. And if you can be the person that helped make that happen, guess what? Someday you'll be up there on their Mount Rushmore of influence yourself. And when that magical moment happens, there'll be 3 words to sum up how you feel. It don't get no better than this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joe. We also, I'll give you the Rotary coin with our 4-way test
Oh, thank you.
on that.
Thank you very much.
Also, we make a donation to the Rotary Woods and Rain Garden at Central Park, Arboretum. And your daughter is probably taking her class down there. It's only a couple blocks from her school.
Oh, fantastic,
So
fantastic.
in honor of our speakers, we make a donation in your honor.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.